Well, hello and welcome back to Politics in the Pulpit, brought to you by the Joint Public Issues team. My name is Matt Forsyth, and as always, your host for this current season. And my goodness, it's good for us to be back again, talking all things politics in the pulpit. But as always, I'm not alone in this podcast, which I'm always grateful for because I do need some wise insight to help me with these lectionary readings on a weekly basis, and I wonder if you do too. This week, we have special guests. We've got Kathy Galloway. Welcome to you to the podcast. Welcome,
Thank
Kathy.
you.
It's good to see you. And a returning voice and face to the podcast, Paul Morrison. Welcome back to the Joint Public Issues team's Politics in the Pulpit. Welcome back, Paul.
Hi.
It's good to see you both, and it was nice before we began a recording that we could rekindle spirits. Kathy and Paul have worked together in a previous moment. It was nice to rekindle some of that conversation, and I'm sure we hopefully can rekindle that in this podcast today. But before we go into our lecture readings, and for those of you that are listening here today, we do have to recognise, of course, we do gather in the context of all things that are happening in the world, but also in our nation. We're recognizing there's news afoot in the political spheres. Breaking news this morning, as we're recording, was that President Biden has issued a pardon for his son Hunter Biden, and that is news that has been breaking this morning. There's also more harrowing images that we're seeing happening in the Ukraine, in particular, as the war continues to decimate so much of that country. But also recognizing here in the United Kingdom too, there's still the ongoing aftermath of the floods that people are then still recovering from, but also the dangers of plummeting temperatures, especially as we're beginning to see the need for night shelters increasing as well in this given month. So just a couple of things that might be hitting our news, things that we're reflecting about, but also we might want to weave into some of our preaching and teaching too. But before we go into our lecture readings and talk a bit about maybe the important dates coming up, let's get to know our guests. Kathy Galloway, it's good to have you in the podcast. Do you want to just
Thank you.
tell those listening a little bit about yourself, but also maybe why politics in the pulpit might be something that you're particularly passionate about as well?
I live in Glasgow. I've lived here for over 30 years. Um, and I have spent almost all my working life working in contexts concerned with peace and social justice. Most of my professional life has been spent in the employment of the Iona community. So I've done several jobs with them. I've been warden of the Abbey and leader of the community. I also spent several years working for Church Action on Poverty, and more recently, I worked as the head of Christian Aid in Scotland. Um, my background is in studying theology, and I am a minister of the Church of Scotland. But as I say, virtually all my work has been in an ecumenical context and not actually in the employment of the Church of Scotland. So, and I'm also a writer. I'm retired from full-time employment, but I do a lot of writing. I write poetry and uh, stuff that I suppose could be described as spirituality. Um, um, a lot of reflecting on social justice issues, really.
So it's incredible, and we're really fortunate to have you on the podcast today to kind of give us your insight, so your experience, your lived experience as well, and the stories of others too. So thank you,
Mm-hmm.
Kathy. And I wonder just before we go into lecture readings and talk a bit about our scriptures today, just pick up what you just said right at the end there about the spirituality, the writing that you're involved with.
Yeah.
Where do you find when I say space, but where do you find inspiration for your writings now? Where do you go to feel inspired? Just maybe people that might be starting this Advent season wanting to maybe have a bit of expression of their creativity. Where do you find inspiration for your writing?
Um, I find I find inspiration actually in things that are just around me in the present moment. I find a lot of inspiration in the earth and in my own habitat in a way. Uh, in one of the key threads of my work has been in relation to climate and climate justice. For many, many years, I've been a member of the Green Party for a very long time. Um, but so, but I, but for me, it's really important. I'm kind of influenced by a kind of Zen practice of really being attentive to what's there and to try and so I write lots of haiku. I try and I just try and observe what's there in its reality and not, try and remove all my projections from that. So I find it in that, and then utterly and completely, I find it in people and the life of people,
Yeah.
and um, the incredible courage and spirit of people, which is everywhere.
Yeah. That's really helpful. And I hope those that listen maybe have thought about taking a step into creative writing can kind of draw some inspiration from your wisdom there as well, in terms of relationships, in terms of maybe also some of the practices of what you've just mentioned there might help us too as we kind of engage with some of these texts as well, I think,
Yeah.
and scripture and reasoning as well. Um, Paul, of course, we're coming off the heels of COP29, and some of your colleagues, of course, have been writing a lot about COP29. Have you got any last reflections that you'd want to offer into that space of COP29 as a whole? Of course, there was some quick pieces of work happened right near the end of COP29, as Simeon said last week. It always seems to be the way. But is there any kind of settling, do you think, from COP29, or do you think that's still to come in the months ahead? What are any thoughts that you have on that?
I think so. My role within JPIT is around poverty and economics. And I think there's the reflection I constantly have around climate change is that the link between the sort of economic imperative to grow and grow and grow and the damage that economic growth does to the environment
Yeah.
and how it seems that policy which is designed to grow the economy and policy which is designed to reduce our impact on the environment are contradictions.
Yeah.
Mm,
And there's a real question about whether or not we're facing up to it.
mm,
So yes, it is great that there's some money going in climate mitigation. There's about 300 billion's been pledged, whether that will actually arrive, but that's not enough.
mm,
And frankly, when you look around, you see that there is so much wealth and so much being extracted from
Yeah.
the earth, and yet people are living in poverty. And it's not that there's not enough. It's not that the Lord hasn't given abundantly. It's that we've chosen to distribute it in a utterly unfair manner.
mm,
And at the end of every COP, you see these
Yeah.
ideas being played with, but actually that core contradiction is the thing we need to think about, and I think is the thing as Christians we're called to think about.
absolutely.
And I think that just coming in there, uh, other bad news just in the last couple of days is that a global meeting to try and reduce the impact of plastic in the seas has collapsed without any agreement at all
Mm,
because the oil producing countries would not, would not agree to the kinds of things that would be necessary. I
mm,
mean, it's just it's very visible now what is stopping progress being made.
mm, absolutely. And it's
And this
something.
is, I mean, the plastics are so damaging, not just to the oceans, but to marine life, to human life.
And it's absolutely, I'm glad you brought that into the story for us, Kathy, because I think it widens the conversation, isn't it? And I think for part of my encouragement around our thinking from a local church level, and indeed the context in which I come from in the Methodist district in Northampton, is that we're trying to always broaden this conversation of our environment to its broadest sense. Of course, there's the climate commitments, about big picture, to talk about oil, but talk about transition to green energy. But actually, there's also a much wider plethora of conversation about whether it's about plastics, whether it's about our biodiversity, whether it's about our spaces, our green spaces, and actually widening this conversation out to bring awareness in the wholeness of the challenge that we're facing. And I think that's important as well. But we lament as well, I think, within all of that, of decisions being made or inaction sometimes happening. And we lament at that. And I think there is it feels like a recurring theme sometimes. That it's almost just not enough each time. And I think that's been some of the reflection from cops, isn't it? Is that there's always a decision made, but sometimes there's that feeling as if to say it's just not enough yet. And when will we get to that point? It is a question maybe for us to keep asking, to keep challenging for, of course, as well, but not to lose hope in all of this. And speaking of hope, we are in that season of waiting. We're in that season of waiting of the second Sunday of Advent coming up, of course, and I think it's important for us to continue to reflect about what does Advent look like for our context, but also for contexts around the world, in particular those contexts that are facing conflict and war, but also those that are victims of crime and genocide. And there's also on the 9th of December, International Day of Commemoration and Dignity of Victims of Crime or Genocide for us to be able to mark as well. And that, I think, dovetails really well into Human Rights Day on the 10th of December too. So some important dates this Advent season for us to maybe reflect about as well in our lecture readings, which we have today. We have Philippians chapter 1, verses 3 to 11. You can go to the Apocrypha, not the main Bible canon, of course, but Baruch 5, 1 to 9. Go into two moments in Luke's Gospel, Luke chapter 3, verses 1 to 6, and then Luke chapter 1, 68 to 79. And so we've got these lovely readings that are offered to us today to be able to look at the lecture readings in a different lens, maybe with Kathy and Paul. I wonder, as we think about these lecture readings coming up, second Sunday of Advent, Kathy, where were your eyes drawn to when you first read these scriptures? Which particular passage stuck out to you, and maybe why?
Um, just having, particularly reading the two gospel readings and the Philippians reading, one of the things that I've been kind of reflecting on about this Advent is that we have a tendency generally in the church to approach it as if we're waiting for the birth of a baby. As if somebody in our church is having a great expectation, and everybody's very excited about it. So all our preparations are for the birth of the baby. And sometimes I think that's really unhelpful, because it leads us to think that actually the baby has been born. The baby was born, the baby lived, the baby died. The Jesus who came as a liberator and as a savior lived and died, and for Christians we believe that then lived and died and brought new life and new hope. And I think perhaps because the Advent readings are so, in a sense, ubiquitous. I have attended performances of the Messiah every year since I was 10, partly through having a mother that sang in a choir. But, so many of these readings, they're part of my being, and they are of millions of people. and there's a kind of comfort in their familiarity, but it stops the address of them because the question now is not, you know, what difference will Jesus coming make? Because we know it was what difference will Jesus' birth make to us, and what has it made to us? Um, and we can rejoice in that, but be challenged by that as well. And so for me, the real the most challenging reading, but also the most I mean, they're all inspiring, but you know the Lucan readings, particularly Luke 3, you know, it's like reading it's like hearing one of the great speeches. It's like it's kind of like, you know, Martin Luther King. I had a dream, or Abraham Lincoln talking about, you know, government by the people, for the people, by the people, will not vanish from the earth. You know, it's a great inspirational text, and the poetry of it is inspirational. But I'm really challenged, and I would really like to engage with the Philippians one, because that's about how we live now.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's not a separate. It's, you know, it's not a historical story that we remember in you know every possible way. It's about how we live now, and it's about partnership, and that is such a fundamental thing in Christian faith. And it's why
Absolutely.
we're engaged in, you know, it's why politics are important.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And before we dive into that Philippians reading, because you're absolutely right. I wonder, Paul, if you've got any reflections on what Kathy just said there, you know, really helpfully for us about how much of this season sometimes can be used as preparation for the arrival of Jesus, but actually we recognize that Jesus has come, has lived, did what the amazing Jesus did do, but then also then died on the cross and rose again. I wonder what reflections off the back of that have conjured up for you when you read these scripture readings, and maybe has it, you know, has it triggered any kind of thoughts for you?
I think I sort of when I read them, they were so familiar,
Mm.
and especially the Luke 1 reading, which is it's poetry and it's
Mm.
beautiful, and it's, you know, it felt sort of like a warm bath. It was just a lovely thing to hear. But I was wondering this how I would preach that. I can't preach a warm bath.
Yes.
You can read it and you can let it sit with people. But I sort of, when I looked through the different readings, I thought, what is it that I would want to say about
Mm.
today, about the situation we find ourselves in now? I think, like Kathy, my head was just drawn towards the Philippians readings, and
Mm.
actually, I smiled a lot because of the word when you mentioned the word partnership. That's the
Mm.
thing that's sort of double underlined in my notes. That
Mm-hmm.
was the thing that felt that was the word that felt most relevant to today as to where about partnership and working in partnership rather than as individuals struggling through this alone. We work as partners. We work with partners with each other and partners with God
Mm.
in trying to bring forward His kingdom and live out what Kathy's talked about, which is the life we should have after Jesus has lived, died, and been resurrected. So
I want to pick up on that word partnership, Paul. I want to stay a few Paul just for a minute, and then I'll come to you, Kathy, because you know, for both your experiences in what you laid your hands to, um, where have you seen partnership done well to help those on the economic margins? And I wonder, Paul, if I can come to you first and ask that question, where have you seen partnership done well, that we can learn from as a model, as kind of principles? Like, where have you seen it done really well, that partnership lived out? And it doesn't have to be a big scale, you know, it could be any scale here, but where have you seen partnership really work well to help, you know, those on the economic margins?
in on Tuesday, I stepped down after 6 years of being a director at Trussell Trust, which is so I'm in a bit of mourning at the moment,
Mm.
actually, because it's such a
Mm.
wonderful organization to be associated with.
Mm.
We went through this huge rebranding exercise last year, and you may have noticed its logos change and things like that. But the word that came out, and of all of the sort of research that is necessary in that, was partnership, and our logo is two. Uh, Essentially, it's two curves interacting because that's meant to talk about partnership. And it was the understanding that Trussell Trust exists to end the need for food banks. And it
Mm.
was utterly clear that it's not something Trussell Trust can do alone. But in places where we have good partnerships, working with citizens advice, we can help people make their first visit to the food bank the last visit if we get benefits right.
Mm.
There's all sorts of things that can be done, but one of the key things, and that's sort of the place where I find partnership works is transformative, is we're doing a mentoring program
Mm.
in which people who are decision makers who have power in the organization or in other organizations are mentored for a year by someone with lived experience of poverty and hardship. And I can't tell you what that changes, but I can tell you it utterly changes people's attitudes. I don't know what decisions have been made differently, but I know that just that human relationship, that connection that happens is what transforms people. And and for me, it's finding places and ways to make those connections
Mm.
is what's transformative.
That's- and part of that theme comes a bit out in the Philippians why the letter's being written in the first place, that kind of mentorship, that kind of, care and love. And we see it kind of exuberated in, thank my God in remembrance of you. Like there is that kind of commitment that is deeply personal. And I think mentoring is a deeply personal kind of commitment to be making, but how profound a difference it can make in partnership when it's done um, from the position of just selfless kind of giving, isn't it? That's a really helpful, and thank you, Paul, and thank you, in the context of, of what you just said in terms of your role changing, etc. Just and sharing that story with us. And Kathy, again, you kind of picked up on kind of some of your working history and what you've been involved with. And I wonder, like Paul, have you seen partnership? Where have you seen partnership, really done well to help those on the economic margins? Is there an example in your story that you can remember or glean from?
You have several hours.
Well,
Really.
we go long form. We can go the extra podcast.
But I work for Christian Aid,
Mm.
which is full of examples of
Mm.
important and significant partnerships. And one of the very good things about working for Christian Aid is that it puts our society, and particularly Western societies, in context. So a few years ago, I was traveling in Bolivia, visiting partners there, and I was visiting with our Bolivian partners, and they were organizing like a kind of a church community workers weekend, like a kind of things that happens here all the time, except it wasn't quite the same. So we went off and we ended up in this, what I think was probably a school, a small village school, really in the middle of nowhere. And there was just a hall, and over the next couple of hours, people just appeared, and they mostly travelled on buses, and they came, from all different parts of Bolivia, and some of them had travelled hours and hours and hours on buses to get there, and they came with bedrolls on their back, and they came, with from Christian from faith contexts where they had very little. But boy, were they resourceful with what they had. And they were so filled with delight at being able to be together. And it was a real celebration for them as well. Well, for us as well. We had dancing and singing and so on. And it really it was another of these very humbling occasions where people just remind me certainly of how very rich most of us are. Not, obviously lots of people in this country are very marginalized, and there's absolutely no excuse for that. It's shameful. I'm ashamed of so much of our country's life and policy. And I think, what is wrong with people that they want to, that growth is seen as a great goal, when it's so damaging to everybody, really, including to the people who are, what do? You end up like Elon Musk, who has got more money than he knows what to do with. So now he's going to use it to be a kind of quasi-president. Is that what we, climbed out of the swamps and emerged from the caves and, developed through thousands and thousands of years to end up with? And for me, the kind of partnerships that really speak are the ones that enable people to walk side by side and to recognize that being rich is not a virtue.
Yes.
And that being poor is a limit, not a failing. And I think that this passage in Philippians is so great because, it's Paul at his maternal best, and Paul is very maternal sometimes. He just loves these little churches. And he's in prison at this point during where the reading is set. And there's lots of upheaval, political and economic upheaval in Philippi. But he's just, encouraging, and actually you can see that this relationship means a lot to him as well. It's not just about him, being the giver. He's also the receiver in this story, and that, so that the partnership in that is one not just of giving, because our churches are very good at giving. We're just not always so very good at receiving.
Absolutely. And it strikes me that this passage, I think, Paul is writing a place of just absolutely passionate love for Christ first and foremost, and therefore for Christ's people. And there's that sense of just that.
No, not therefore.
Yeah.
Not therefore, but as well as.
Yeah.
We don't just love people for, I don't love my children because of Christ. I love them because of them. And the giftedness that we have is that, the message of Christ is, and the example of Christ is, to love what we have been given and to give back. And so I don't love anybody, on behalf of anybody else. I love them for themselves.
Yeah, that's really helpful, and that's a really helpful distinction as well, actually, and a helpful challenge, I think, for all of us.
Meaning to,
No, it's good. No, it's absolutely right, because actually, I think for all of, especially at this, thinking of it being in the second Advent season that we're in right now, I think that is a particularly important thing when we think about gift giving and other things alike too, because actually, it frames it in such a different way as to what does unconditional love look like, and actually what does that mean, um, especially for those in church leadership. I think going into this season and beyond, I think this passage challenges us to really look inward in a deep way as to how are we partnering, and who are we partnering with, and what does that look like coming into this Advent season and beyond. We recognize that the world is not getting easy at points. The challenges of last year still remain, if not deeper, for many people. You've got to scratch beneath the surface and see the challenges that people are facing. And so, actually, how are we deepening partnership in a way which is caring, loving, sacrificial? I think is a profound challenge. And this passage, I think, really draws us into how are we modeling that partnership first and foremost. How are we doing that, and what does that look like? Any other kind of reflections on, we talk about partnership, but is there any other reflections about the Thanksgiving and the prayer that Paul's offering here? That how would you preach on it? You spoke a bit earlier, Paul, about you can't preach a warm bath. That maybe is what the Luke Gospels offers us. But how would you preach if this is not a warm bath? What is this then?
Oh, I wouldn't wish anyone to hear that as a denigration. I think it's a beautiful thing. It's an absolutely lovely thing. And it's a real gift that we
Yeah.
can read it and feel encouraged and sort of comforted by it. But the Philippines, and the more I reflect on it and listen to what Kathy said, she's talking about these two, I think there's these two versions, the world's version of what a flourishing life is,
Mhm.
Yeah.
which is wealth and more and more. And there's a flourishing life that you can absolutely see dripping out of the page here, which
Mhm.
is one which is of love for the people around him, and one which is of love for the people he works with, and one which is about partnering with the people around him to try create something better, to share that love and to share what Jesus is offering people. And for me, I, if I was preaching on it, I think that contrast between what the sort of what a flourishing life would look like, especially frankly at the moment, I always get really sort of, people compare me to Scrooge about this time of year because I really don't like plastic things being put up on walls which are going to
No.
end up in a landfill. I don't like the consumerism. I don't really like the sort of the excessive gift giving. I put excessive there so as to not sound completely like Scrooge. I don't, because it feels like a way of an ideal of flourishing life, which is about access, which is about more.
Yeah.
And I think there is a joy in gift giving, and every culture in the world does reciprocity in some ways, and there's a joy when it's about showing love and when it's about showing compassion and reciprocity. But when it's about, and I think making that distinction at this time of year, because most of that culture of gift giving is about, one hopes, about love and about care and about concern, but it can fall into something which is about a form of flourishing life that I don't think we would want to put forward, which is about getting more. So that is feels like where I would head with this passage, but I don't.
Mm.
There are many places it can go. Um, and I just actually I want to tell a story to Kathy because I'm not sure she would remember this, but when I first read it and I knew you were going to be on the podcast, the time we did a panel together, sort of, it must have been 10, 15 years ago.
Mm.
I didn't know I was meant to speak at the start of it. And they
Oh
said,
dear.
oh, and Paul's now going to speak for 10 minutes on. And I went, and I looked really terrified. And I got up and I gave a 10-minute spiel in the living wage and then sat down and you put your hand on my shoulder and you told me I'd done well. And I can't
Oh.
remember anything else of that day, and that's why I remember it so well. And that's what's happening here. That's what I thought about as soon as I read it was that caring for the person beside you. It matters.
Mm.
Yeah.
It's the thing that stays with you long after many other things, long after the present is gone. It's the care and the compassion that stays with you.
Yeah. And for me, it's also about just trying to see every person, uh, as a person. I think I'm quite influenced by all the Quaker members of the Iona community, and the wish to see that of God in everyone, and so always just sometimes I try and when people are particularly unpleasant, or I do try to see what they were like as a baby. I try to imagine them as a baby, and think, this is a child that somebody, gave birth to, and with all that potential and so on. And, so in the end, people they're not the labels, they are themselves. They're the people themselves. And I suppose, thinking more collectively, it's not possible to to demonstrate love, or of the kind of interpersonal kind, uh, on a wider scale. But so then for me, I think it means, what does it mean to show solidarity with people? I've been very, like so many people, I have spent a year agonizing about what's happening in Palestine, which where I have been several times, and know people well. And this is a heart-rending situation. And at the moment there are, I think it's important that we differentiate between reading what's in the Bible. We need to locate it in its time, and say, this is not, this is something different from what there is today. And how do we negotiate that? I'm going to be spending the rest of this week running a pop-up Palestinian makers market, in a local cafe. I mean, this is such a small thing, but actually, what we've discovered is that, to makers in the West Bank, this is really important, and the connections are really important. It's a reminder that people have not forgotten about them, because there's very little else that's telling them that people have not forgotten about them. As a, they just undergo incredible stresses and difficulties in the West Bank, and have bombs rained down them in Gaza.
Awesome.
And I think that it's also important that solidarity is not necessarily, it's hope, in the sense not of just being sure that things will well, or being optimistic or whatever. Hope is nothing to do with optimism, really. It's a commitment to acting in a way that you believe is right, regardless of the outcome, and to trusting that there is blessing in that. Because for me, that's that also is the message of Jesus. To live hopefully is not to expect the Wizard of Oz come along and make everything all right, and nor is it to assume that the waters of the sea will open up in front of you. It's to recognize that it may lead somewhere very different. um, and just to think that to be committed to that as being a way of being. It's a way, really. I think, for me, again, the seeds of violence are always in violence. So things that we do that are violent produce violent seeds, and that's just the way it is. And it always seems to me incredible that there's so little learning that goes on, so little engagement with alternatives. I mean, we've had so many examples of alternatives, but we just forget them all the time.
Absolutely. But I think through all of that, I think what you've said there for us is a real challenge, a deep-rooted challenge that I think we want to end on today for us and those that are listening today to take forward. And lastly, as well, as Paul told the story, happy of that, as I said, that rekindled moment we were brought back together of you two in this podcast today, of that moment you first met. Actually, people will never forget how you made them feel. And actually, I think there's something impactful about how we can make people feel, and hopefully in this season and beyond, through our actions, our solidarity, what does that look like, and how that plays out. May we also be able to say, I thank my God every time I remember you. And may we
Yeah.
be able to say that when we think of those that we encounter, both maybe for a brief moment or for a longer period of time. Because who knows, you might be back on a podcast with them in 10 years' time. You just never quite know how things will turn out like that as well. Before we close, just I say goodbye to those of you that are listening, and we appreciate you listening to Politics in the Pulpit as always. If you've not done so already, you can always join us on our YouTube channel and watch us in living color, have these conversations, or subscribe wherever you get your podcasts from. But Kathy, you mentioned a bit about your right at the very beginning. Those that have been inspired by what you said already today, is there anywhere they can go to read more of your writings? Where can they access them, maybe? Or indeed, is there anything else, lastly, you want to just share with those that are listening before we say goodbye?
Well, I have a number of books that are published by Wild Goose Publishing, which is a publishing house of the Iona community. So they could, certainly find things there, or actually older ones. I can't remember, maybe they're all out of print, SPCK. But certainly the Iona communities, Wild Goose Publications, would find that. And my final thing is that the best thing about the Advent readings, in my view, all of them, is that they are trying to encourage us to step up, to be our best selves, rather than to, just be moany, sneery, self-lacerating, or, they're a kind of, for me, they're a kind of taking delight in what's possible and the potential, and just the daily joys of being alive. So I think that, Advent is a time where we should step up, be our best selves.
Absolutely.
See what
Step
that's
up.
like.
I think we should be stepping up into Christmas. I think that's the encouragement there, isn't it?
Yeah.
Not step in, step up into Christmas. Absolutely. Love that. And we'll make sure we put the links in the podcast description as well for what Kathy's mentioned around the publications you've done. So please do go and have a look at that in the podcast descriptor as well. Paul, from your perspective, is there things from the Joint Public Issues team, from your pieces of work that you're aware of, that you want to bring awareness to, for people to use, whether they're engaged with these lectionary readings or indeed in their community's life as a whole as well?
I think As I'm sure the listeners know, there's the JPIT website, jpit.uk, in which there's all sorts of things on it. I write blogs there, usually around poverty and inequality and economics. And I suppose from the start of this conversation, when we talked a little bit about the links between the economy and the environment, there's the stuff that my colleague Steve has written around COP26, and there's also a Bible study pack called Just Economics, because I think it's the hope is that people engage with the idea of the economy because there are lots of moral assumptions baked in. And it's just a start of unpacking those moral assumptions. Probably not a pre-Christmas Bible study group. I think if you started it now, your congregation might be a bit bemused, but for after Christmas, it may be something that's worth looking at.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you both of you, Kathy, Paul. It's been lovely to have you both on Politics in the Pulpit. Thank you for joining us and having this conversation. And just to reiterate what Kathy said as a final comment, there's an engagement and encouragement for us to step up this Advent season. We want to continue to resource you here at Joint Public Issues team. So do take on board what Paul said in terms of the resources that are available to you and your worshiping communities as we do this in partnership together. Of course, the Joint Public Issues team is a partnership of denominations coming together. And so we want to continue to work in that spirit of partnership as we step up in 2025. Bless you all for listening, and we'll see you very soon here at Politics in the Pulpit. Bye for now.
Thank you. Thank you.